How's everybody doing? Okay. You know, you look pretty tired to me. Looks like you've had a rough week. It's not just the Boulder brew pubs either, right? Okay, good. Okay. Well, first of all, let me thank the dean and the conveners here. I like a challenge as much as the next person, but to be the lecturer right after lunch, after you've had an intense week of lectures going before, I think my challenges are laid out before me. So let me introduce myself. I'm Dan Baker. I'm from here in Boulder. I'm director of the Laboratory for Atmospheric and Space Physics, LASP, and also professor in the physics department and the astrophysical and planetary sciences department. And my co-author, that is to say the person I stole a lot of slides from, is Harlan Spence, who was a lecturer here about 3 years ago. And my assignment, I believe, was to try to talk to you about some of the impacts, some of the consequences of energetic particles. Why are they important scientifically? That's one aspect of the question. And whether you're looking at the sun, I know you've had lectures about the sun, and you look at active regions there, or whether you look at synchrotron emission from planets such as Jupiter, or if you're looking at more remote objects like the Crab Nebula here in X-rays, color-coded, and also radio emissions, or at vast, huge objects like extragalactic jets. All of those are really visible because of energetic particles, often energetic electrons, moving in relatively strong magnetic fields. So in many ways, the energetic particles that we can study in and around the Earth's neighborhood, really the processes there are relevant on a cosmic scale, and they really are the thing that gives us a chance to see very remote objects. Let me emphasize here that I'm going to be talking about many different aspects of the energetic particle effects, what we call space weather. Let me see, just as a show of hands, how many of you have read chapters 13 and 14 in volume 2 of the textbooks? I'm not being blinded by the number of hands that have gone up, okay. How many read chapter 3 about space weather? Okay. So I'm going to, sort of go in that order. I'm going to talk about some of the impacts of energetic particles on astronauts, tissue kind of interactions and so on for the first half of this, and then I'm going to talk more about the space weather, some of the things that I'm sort of a practitioner of. And I thought it might be interesting, especially in light of all the stuff you've endured or enjoyed over the last week, to sort of conclude with some of the more recent hot off the press kinds of things associated with the radiation belt storm probes, where I'm an investigator. So I'd like to share with you some of the latest things there. Up at the top, Harlan had quoted a couple of people in his talk, "The Moon is a Harsh Mistress," Robert Heinlein. And then, I guess I'm quoting myself here now, but space is a hostile place. And like George Bernard Shaw, it's often useful to quote yourself. You'll find it adds a lot of spice to your conversation. So first lesson, quote yourself. Okay, so here we're going to talk about principles of radiation protection, talk about the different sources. I know you've had lectures about galactic cosmic rays, I think from Joe Giacalone. I know Norbert talked about energetic particles in other planetary environments. Solar energetic particles have undoubtedly been part of it. So this will be the first sort of lecture, and then we'll go on to some past examples of the effects on spacecraft operation, talk about some future possible human spaceflight implications, and as I say, I'll then spend some time talking about development of models and recent observations and summarize. I do encourage you, if you have questions, this will help keep you and me awake if you ask me questions during the course of this. So just shout out or wave your hand and I'll try to call on you. So let's start through some of the radiation protection kind of issues that those of you who read chapters 13 and 14 know that there are a lot of things in there about radiation is of biological concern. The kind of energetic particles that we see in various places can certainly have severe effects. Protons, charged particles of that sort, photons with sufficient energy can certainly cause impacts. Neutrons can be an important source of radiation damage. And they ionize matter as they pass through or disintegrate and can cause problems for human tissue. So the effects of ionization they can lose energy as they pass through the material. In the textbooks, you'll find graphs like this, the sort of so-called beta block equation, just showing the kind of energy loss that will occur and the kind of range that particles of higher and higher energy can have. So the real point here is that the kind of particles that we are concerned about and that occur in the space environment can certainly produce significant effects. The amount of energy deposition depends on the atomic number. The heavier the ion, the more the effects can be. And nuclear disintegrations and interactions, as shown in this little sketch or this data down here, can really be important. And protecting electronics as well as protecting humans. Both the silicon and the carbon life forms in space can be subjected to very dire consequences. And so this is one of the reasons we worry a lot. When you talk about radiation, there are a lot of different units that fly around. The gray is a unit which tends to be used to characterize the amount of radiation absorbed by living tissues. One gray is defined as 1 joule of absorbed energy per kilogram of matter, tissue, or whatever it may be. And a rad is another unit, and that's 100th of a gray. The damage to the matter depends on the type of radiation. Photons tend to lose less energy. Heavier ions lose a lot of energy as they're interacting. And the quality factor, then, Q, is something that's used to try to roughly quantify what damage is produced by a certain amount of absorbed radiation. And the dose equivalent, the sievert, or the Röntgen equivalent man, are the units that are used for that. And this Q value is determined empirically. That is, it's really through experiments, and it's always normalized, or usually normalized back to what gamma rays do for the same total dose. Okay. So why characterize radiation sources? Well, it's really to understand the risks to astronauts. And these sketches show that there can be damaged chromosomes by this. As a particle goes through a particular cell or so, there can be damage to chromosomes that can have long-lasting consequences, such as cancer, cataracts in the eyes, and we'll talk more about that. And in spacecraft, there are a whole host of things that happen to the silicon life forms in space. Single event upsets, heavy particles interacting on the very microscopic scale, causing memory change, bit changes, bit flips, and so on. There can also be effects on attitude sensors, star trackers, and so forth. And of course, there can be long-term radiation damage. So all of these are things that we would be concerned about from radiation in space. The challenges to radiation protection. This is to protect astronauts and equipment during transit. One thing, I guess it's very, you probably all realize this, but we as humans have grown up in a very special environment. We are surrounded by the magnetic field. The Earth has a strong magnetic field that envelops us and tends to exclude the highest energy, and for that matter, not the very highest, but most of the high energy particles, and certainly all the low energy particles. And we have a dense atmosphere around us that tends to stop the radiation as well. And so we've lived in a cocoon, not only in our lives, but over the entire time that life has developed on Earth. And this is a big factor. Moving into lunar space or beyond into interplanetary space completely changes the whole picture. And one has to think about that. And it's one of the major tall poles, as they say, about traveling beyond low Earth orbit. The understanding the spectrum of radiation and just how it changes. Some things like the very highest part of the galactic cosmic ray spectrum, as you probably learned from Joe Giacalone, is pretty stable, but the lower energies and certainly solar particles and so on can be highly variable, and the radiation belts are highly variable. So the effects depend on the total energy deposited. Again, you see the diagram over there of effects at the DNA level, the rate of radiation dosing, how fast are the particles hitting you, and the particles with the higher energies. So all of these things are things you have to understand if you want to protect yourself from the challenges. Now, threats of radiation, how does one assess this? And for large, immense doses of radiation, such as occurred with the atomic bomb explosions in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, there were statistical kind of relationships that were developed. But then the question was, what is the relationship? How does cancer occurrence, for example, how does that relate to the dose? And then how does it occur when you go to lower and lower doses? And the folks who deal with these kinds of things, and there are several different kinds of organizations, but the radiation protection folks have adopted a linear no threshold kind of model. That is, extrapolating from higher doses but down and assuming that no dose level is really safe or that you really are okay below some point. But there are those who believe, I don't know how many of you speak Greek, but there are those who believe that in the so-called Hormesis, it's a controversial notion that is counter to this no threshold kind of argument. It says that maybe some low doses of radiation are actually good for you. This is sort of the school of thought of what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. But I think this is not a widely shared belief. And so NASA and the people who are involved in human exploration of space really have adopted quite a different view, which is the ALARA principle, as low as reasonably achievable. So trying to keep astronauts, those who are subjected to radiation, to the lowest possible level, limiting exposure, providing shielding, and so forth. And of course, if you're thinking about going to Mars, this might be a 6 to 8 or 10 month kind of cruise through interplanetary space. The probability is very high that you'll be subjected to solar energetic particles. You know for sure, as we'll talk about in a second, that you're going to be subjected to galactic cosmic rays. And so keeping this dose rate down is an important thing. And I don't know how many of you have seen the recent results from the Mars Curiosity flight, but our colleagues across town have really, at the Southwest Research Institute, had the instrument on board the Mars mission and did direct measurements. And in fact, the dose that they were subjected to, you might say, certainly raised concerns again that in a flight to Mars and at Mars, the radiation would be one of the limiting factors. So it might, of course, mean that you have to limit the number of flights, or that the probability would be high that those who are in interplanetary space flight for a long time would suffer debilitating effects, and we'll talk about that. And so the ALARA program really seeks to find ways to limit short-term flight risks and to try to minimize the long-term risk to astronauts while recognizing that you have to be subjected to increased radiation in space. Here are some of the different regulatory bodies. We mentioned the Commission on Radiological Protection before, but a whole host of folks, including the national organizations, governmental organizations like the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, the Department of Energy, OSHA, all weigh on these issues. Now, if you're going to think about protecting from radiation, there are a number of things you might try to do. The mitigation strategy could include having shielding materials, trying to have radioprotectants. There are those who believe or have hoped that that you could just take a pill, and they're working on these kinds of things, pills that would take any damaged cells and sort of rid them from your system as quickly as possible. And so trying to deal with broken DNA, other tissue kind of micro lesions and so forth would all be possible ways of trying to beat down the effects. And these pharmaceuticals, as I say, that might either protect or tend to rid the system of damaged tissue. But all of these also are dependent on age, the mission that you're involved in, the sex, genders, all can play important roles when it comes to this. So the energetic, getting to the topic of the lecture here, the energetic charged particles, that we of course have in our universe at least, hydrogen is the dominant kind of species, and the solar system composition or the primary cosmic rays are completely dominated by, in a number sense, by hydrogen. There's a lot of helium around, and these heavier species are very rare comparatively. But as we talked about before, the atomic number is a crucial thing, and the higher the atomic number, the more damaging this is in a tissue, in a radiological sense. And so despite the apparent scarcity of iron nuclei, nonetheless, they are of great worry in the astronaut business because of the effect of a very energetic ion nucleus passing through matter is so devastating. And so we don't just worry about the primary cosmic ray protons, we worry about all of these heavy ions. So what is the cosmic ray energy spectrum? I hope this looks familiar to you. I hope you all saw this from probably multiple sources, but this is the famous cosmic ray spectrum extending from the things I study, by the way, the things I like to study are all off scale down. They're completely ignored down here, below where this turns on. I'm very offended by this curve, but nonetheless. The very high energy particles really, as you go to the highest energies here, can be of macroscopic kind of energy. And so Fermilab protons are sort of up there, but a bounced super ball, a pitched baseball is up toward the end, and a hockey puck way up at the end, presumably getting hit directly by, and importantly by something like a pitched baseball or a hockey puck wouldn't be a good day for you. When these hit the Earth's atmosphere, these very high energy particles tend to cascade into other particles and cause huge showers and so forth. So it's really for damage to humans, it's really the protons, say greater than a few tens of million electron volts, that really are the most concern. The galactic cosmic rays, if you went outside our solar system entirely, as the Voyagers are doing now, you start to see much closer to the complete primary galactic cosmic ray spectrum. However, as you get deeper inside, and again, you probably heard this from Terry and Joe and other people, that while our magnetosphere, our Earth's magnetosphere protects us to a very substantial degree, we have another form of protection, which is that the outward flowing solar wind, the embedded magnetic field in the solar wind. These things also tend to exclude a lot of energetic particles that otherwise would reach the Earth's vicinity. And so there's a rollover of the spectrum as one goes down between, say, 100 and 1,000 MeV. The spectrum starts to roll over from presumably its extended primary spectrum. And so we are actually seeing a huge modulation over the course of a solar cycle, say, or over longer time about the energetic particles that actually reach our vicinity. The modulation is really due to interaction with the solar wind, the interplanetary magnetic field, and so this is another way of looking at what I was just saying, which is that as you go outward in the distance from the bow shock, the outer part, as I say, where Voyager now is, you have the full intensity. But as you start to go deeper into our solar system, you start to dramatically reduce the population of these low to moderate energy particles that would be coming from extra solar system sources, from galactic sources. I guess you know that the galactic cosmic rays are thought to be produced at strong shocks, supernova remnants, and so on. And that is an important topic in itself to understand how particles are accelerated to these most immense energies. But the net result is that over the course of the 11 and 22-year solar cycle, as shown by this inset, that we actually see quite a large change in the energetic particle flux. And in the most recent times, again, you probably know that the sun went through its deepest minimum of activity, the most profound minimum of activity in the last years or so, during the period from about 2008 to about 2010. And that, at that time, the cosmic rays were recorded to be the highest that they've been seen in the space age. So having very weak solar activity, which might you think would be good if you're an astronaut and you're going to Mars, well, there's always something. And so reducing the solar activity just means that there can be more galactic cosmic rays. And so one way or another, I guess radiation will get you. So the galactic cosmic ray composition is shown here. And as I noted before, although the spectrum looks pretty innocuous, several orders of magnitude lower by comparison to the protons, nonetheless, there are enough iron, heavy ions at high energies that these are, in fact, quite a worry, both as far as single event upsets in electronics, spacecraft, but also a worry for human tissue damage and things of that sort. Now, what about the long term, the big picture? There have been inferences of the heliospheric magnetic field going back hundreds of years, and this inferred magnetic field is portrayed here, and some studies show that we are right now at the highest interplanetary magnetic field strength in the last 500 years or so. And putting that together with the cosmic ray picture suggests that, and is supported by the data, that the cosmic ray fluxes have been at a relatively low level, quite a low level in recent times compared to much earlier times. That, again, suggests that this might be one of the best times that we've had for human exploration when the galactic cosmic rays are more minimized. Otherwise, you could imagine that at several times higher neutron and other fluxes, and primary cosmic ray fluxes in earlier times, this could be very damaging to humans. So why do we care? Well, we made the point before that space radiation is much more damaging than what we typically see on Earth. The energy spectrum, heavy ions really matter a lot. And they really are what ultimately probably there are many risks. Let me say this. I recognize, although I'm not a space engineer exactly, I recognize that getting the engine to burn on this is probably a bigger risk for whether you'll get back to Earth than the cosmic rays. But as far as your long-term success and the likelihood that your round trip will get you back to Earth alive really depends a lot on the radiation that you're going to be subjected to. And so if we're going to have a program of lunar and ultimately Mars exploration, we have to learn how to deal with this radiation problem. Now, the galactic cosmic rays are one part of the story, but you've also heard about the solar energetic particles. I won't spend so much time on this because I think you've probably heard the story very well. But the solar energetic particles, although much less steady in character, are sporadically can be very, very intense and can be life-threatening indeed. So the combination of active regions on the sun, solar flares, and coronal mass ejections can be immensely worrisome, both from a spacecraft operation standpoint and from a human exploration standpoint. We've had a lot of tools. I hope you've seen during the course of the week a lot of the tools that we tend to use to see what the sun is doing and to understand the radiation from the sun. The SOHO mission has been serving immensely well from the time of its launch in the mid-90s to the present time, taking beautiful images of the sun. but also showing a lot about the variability of the sun. Here's a picture at solar maximum showing the active regions. Over here is an event period that has proven very important from a space weather or space environment standpoint. The animation shows data starting out here with UV images of a flare region, then showing that flare going off. Coronal mass ejection, in fact, was released, as you see here. The snow that you see appearing in the picture is really the very high energy charged particles from the sun, the solar energetic particles, that are tending to blind the CCD camera that's taking these images. So this so-called Halloween storm that occurred at the end of October of 2003 was one of the largest events of the previous solar cycle and really caused a whole host of different kinds of space weather effects I'll talk about during the course of the rest of this pair of lectures. But I just want you to see, it doesn't take a lot of imagination to put your eyes or your brain in the place of that CCD camera and think about what all of those charged particles passing through you would really do to you. And so bear that in mind. So what about the coronal mass ejection? Maybe this has been shown during the course of the week as well. It's one of my favorite NASA animations. And it really, this is not data now, this is a artist's concept. Fran came back in. I don't know if she's going to criticize this one as severely as she did the other cartoons or not, but let's see. But here's the sun. It blasts off material, maybe 10 billion tons of material or so, moving out perhaps at several million miles an hour. The interplanetary field, if it's the right orientation, can interconnect with the Earth's magnetic field, loading a boatload of energy, that's a technical term, into the magnetosphere, dumping energy into the auroral regions, and ultimately leading to a host of space weather effects I'll talk about toward the end of the lecture. So these coronal mass ejections are sort of the story. They really have been the story of the space weather concerns, and they really have play a tremendous role in the ultimate acceleration of particles to high energies. This is a very busy picture, and I'm sorry to sort of show it in a sense, but it's looking down on top of the sun, showing some of the magnetic field connectivity, the Parker spiral, and the things you've learned about, the coronal mass ejection, this blob of material driving as a piston. But depending on where you are as an observer, whether if you're connected over far away from the source region or far away from the shock in front of the coronal mass ejection, you may see a fairly wimpy kind of energetic particle enhancement. On the other hand, if you're well connected magnetically to the shock that's propagating out at huge speed and with great power, this may be accelerating charged particles up to quite high energies, great intensity. You may see a very sharp, intense rise in the energetic particles. So it's not only what happens in a global sense, but where you are relative to what's happening and how you're connected magnetically that dictates how important the energetic particle enhancement is going to be to the rest of your day. What about solar radiation storms? The energetic particle effects are on a scale of S1 to S5. This is the kind of NOAA scale about the significance. I think you've got these on your computers. Probably can't. I can hardly imagine you reading them from the back of the room. But the S1 are sort of minor storms. There are maybe many dozens of these per 10-year, 11-year solar cycle. The stronger storms, the S2 and S3, can have some biological consequences, can limit the amount of extravehicular activity, for example, that astronauts might be able to engage in. There might be a dozen or two of those typically during a solar cycle. The ones you worry about are the severe and the extreme, the S4 and S5. These are very intense events. A few of them occur per solar cycle, and when they do, they can have very severe consequences, both for spacecraft operation and, of course, for humans operating outside the protective envelope of Earth's magnetosphere. And so, just as you can imagine and have probably heard about hurricanes having different severity levels, or tornadoes or other storms, solar storms also are ranked on these kinds of scales. So what about the active sun in the last solar maximum? Pardon? Yes, Maria. Yeah, that was an S4, I believe. It wasn't the most severe solar energetic particles. It actually was, what was interesting about that was that there were so many events in sequence that they sort of compounded one another. But if you had taken the initial one, for example, I think it was an S4, I think the confounding effect probably led to getting close to the S5 level for the Halloween storm. Well, you know, you're raising a very good question. A storm that might be very powerful as far as the coronal mass ejection speed, let's say, or the strength of the interplanetary field, might also be fairly wimpy when it comes to the energetic particles and vice versa. The evidence is, and we'll talk more about the Carrington event, but from the radiological information, from the atmospheric chemical information, carbon-14, beryllium-10, suggests that the Carrington event was probably both a hugely powerful fast shock and strong storm, but also probably very, very powerful as far as. If you get the perfect storm, from a space weather practitioner's point of view, with a coronal mass ejection that's moving at blind speed, that has strong shock in front of it, has the right magnetic field orientation, wave goodbye. I mean, it's going to be a very bad day for our technology. Any other questions? Great, okay. Yes, Norbert. Are you a student here, sir? Are you? Yeah. Yeah. And in fact, it caused the failure of the instrument that was on one of the Mars missions that was put there to measure radiation. So that's not a good thing when your radiation monitor fails. And the thing again I'd emphasize about Halloween storm is it was popping off these solar disruptions in rapid sequence, and so they started to converge. By the time you got out to Saturn, I think they were probably overlapping one another. Yes, and by the time months later, I guess by the time you got out to Voyager, at the fringe of the solar system, they were actually had compounded one another, so they were actually forcing the outer fringes of the solar system to expand outward by 30% or something like that. Yes? Yeah? Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's an excellent question. In fact, I'm going to, just to thumb ahead quickly here, at the end of the second lecture, I'm going to talk to you about an event that occurred last year that had a DST value larger than the inferred one for the Carrington event. So let me talk to you, hold your question, let's talk about that. There's a lot of question about how reliably we know some of these things, but last year's event, I'm pretty confident, since I just submitted a paper on it, that it must be true. And the events can become very large. But there are some fascinating questions about the statistics of very strong solar disturbances. So let's come back to your question, okay? Okay, so the active sun. I made this point before, but here is July. I guess we have a storm for almost every known holiday now, at least a U.S. holiday. So this is the Bastille Day event. That's a French holiday. Okay, sorry. But the active sun seen in extreme ultraviolet, see all the active regions, the knots of magnetic field and everything. 6.5 hours later, after a solar storm has occurred, again, the CCD camera is almost totally blinded by this. So these are can be very powerful storms. This happened to be one where the interplanetary field was not so propitious for causing major geomagnetic activity, but it caused a huge solar energetic particle storm. So what do energetic particles do? Well, they can cause single event upsets, as mentioned. They can these passing through microelectronics, through memory chips and so on, can cause severe effects. This is a Harlan slide. He asked, so what? Very powerful solar variability. Near solar minimum, there are few sunspots, few flares, pretty quiet corona. That's generally true. But there can be, even during these pretty quiet times, well after the solar maximum, there can be giant sunspot groups, and they can cause problems. And so this was this event in 2005, January, right on the limb of the sun. But you remember the magnetic connection we talked about? So the magnetic fields mapped that were coming to Earth sort of mapped from that location. And in just in a minute or two, the charged particle flux, certainly less than a few tens of minutes, the charged particle flux went up several orders of magnitude. This would have been the kind of thing that if you were on the moon or so, you would have had very little, let's say, confidence or awareness, possibly, that this active region was going to blast off behind the limb of the sun and irradiate you with such an intense flux of high-energy particles. So I was privileged several years back to chair a panel for the National Research Council for the National Academies that was tasked to look at the space radiation hazards and the vision for space exploration, as it was called in those days. Our report really did involve people with credentials, not like me, but with credentials about space radiation effects on humans. And this workshop and this report, I think, were pretty important in talking about what the impacts would be that a one REM kind of event, like one CAT scan, can cause scintillations in the eyes, can penetrate through hardened shelter. The spacesuit on the moon would, behind that kind of shielding, you could still get 50 REMs of radiation, and above that you get vomiting, fatigue. Vomiting in I don't know if you heard the news story yesterday about water in the spacesuit, but imagine vomit in the spacesuit. Okay, sorry, we're right after lunch, Maria. I'm sorry. Yeah. 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 Right. Right. So throwing up in a spacesuit or so is definitely a life-threatening problem. And of course, long-term exposure at these levels certainly causes blood problems, fatigue, and sudden appearance of something of the 300 REM level could be fatal very quickly. And these kind of high-dose kind of events from this is the one that we're talking about for January. Satellites were lost, airplanes were diverted, and so on. By the way, the plan on the moon, I often wondered, I can talk about this later if you like, but what was the plan on the moon for radiation protection? If they knew that a solar storm was going to occur, the plan, I'm not kidding you, was to dig a hole for the more senior of the astronauts to get in the hole, and then the more junior person to get on top to help protect against the most intense radiation. This didn't seem like, especially if you were a junior officer, didn't seem like such a good plan to me, but I sincerely hope that our new astronaut training plan has a little better plan than that for how to deal with it. This is the story. The Apollo 16 occurred in April of 1972. The Apollo 17 was in December, and in August of 1972, there was a very, very powerful solar disturbance. Not so much in the DST sense again, but very powerful as far as the energetic particles. It still in many ways sets the standard. And so if that had occurred a few months earlier, a few months later, we could have been having a very different conversation about the Apollo program. Yeah. I think most people would ascribe luck more than, because there was an active cycle, and as this result from Dick Maywalt shows, these can occur anytime, and there's increasing probability around maximum, and tends to be right after the sunspot maximum. But as the case I was showing you before, you can be in sort of dead solar minimum and still have an active region go off and cause a solar energetic particle event. So don't underestimate the value of luck when you're carrying out a space mission, you know. Okay, so here you see that these can occur anytime, and they really go up well above the galactic cosmic ray flux level. So let's go back to the Halloween storm. Maria asked a good question, and so one of the things, bringing this most of you probably won't end up being astronauts. I hope some of you will, if you want to be. But bringing it back to our more routine daily life, airlines have been increasingly flying now over the polar regions. This shortens the travel time and diminishes the amount of fuel you have to use and so on to fly. And you usually are flying at a place where there aren't strong headwinds. And so this is actually a great place to fly. But when you fly at these high latitudes, there can be severe effects, both radio communication outages and in the Halloween storm. Again, I don't know if you can see this well, but this is the polar view looking down. This entire red region was hugely irradiated by solar particles that are funneled along the magnetic field of the Earth down into the polar region. And so airline crews worry a great deal about flying through intense radiation due to solar storms. And so they will again divert from these kind of polar routes that time. So to summarize radiation hazards, I've got a little more segment in this first lecture but about the radiation belts. But let's just remind ourselves that the galactic cosmic rays can be a big problem, can be an issue, and solar energetic particles can be a very acute source of radiation. And then finally, the trapped radiation in the Earth. I'm going to spend more time in the second lecture about this, but I just want to say that Norbert gave a great pair of talks about the planetary magnetospheres, the outer planets, and so on. The belts are not radioactive per se, but they contain the magnetic fields confine ionizing radiation, and the Earth's dipole in particular, tilted offset dipole, leads to one region, the South Atlantic anomaly region, that can be a very severe problem for spacecraft operation. Various versions of this, I'm sure, have been shown during the lectures. This is the iconic picture probably of the space age of Pickering, Van Allen, Pickering here, JPL director Van Allen, and Werner von Braun holding aloft the Explorer 1 engineering model after the successful launch of Explorer 1. James Van Allen discovered the Van Allen belts. As I've said, Van Allen had a good sense of humor about this. I was in his presence once when a reporter asked, "What are the Van Allen belts good for?" And he said, "They hold up Van Allen's pants." And I thought it was a good answer. He really did, in many ways, invent the space age with his use of robust detectors to make measurements in situ in space. What they discovered, again, as you've learned, is that from an electron standpoint, there's a torus, a belt, or these sort of inner tubes surrounding the Earth, a very high energy electron population, an intense variable electron population, the outer Van Allen zone, a weaker inner zone separated by a slot region. And then commingled with the electron inner zone is a belt of very high energy protons due to the Cran source that I think Norbert talked to you about. Other radiation regions around other planets, Pioneer 10 and 11, confirmed what had been seen from Earth with synchrotron radiation, that there are radiation belts around Jupiter, very, very intense radiation. And this radiation, whether it's in Jupiter's magnetosphere, Earth's magnetosphere, wherever, these, especially the high-energy electrons, can cause very significant operational problems. The high-energy electrons can penetrate very, very readily through shielding, can deposit energy in insulating material, can bury themselves in insulating material, such as boards on spacecraft. And when these charges build up in the insulating material, they can lead to a powerful discharge, like a little lightning strike in space. This can be very detrimental, can cause failures. So just to come to sort of a close here for the first part of this lecture, there are many practical motivations associated with solar disturbances and the energetic particles. the drivers of space weather, as we tend to refer to this now, and this fills the Chapter 3 that Sten Oldenwald wrote about. But whether it's the prompt effects from solar X-rays, high-energy photon emission, or whether it's the coronal mass ejections that tend to produce effects in a day or a few days at most, the shock waves in front of those and the acceleration of the particles, the solar energetic particles that can arrive very quickly from an active region or can be associated with the outward propagating, and are in fact associated with the outward propagating coronal mass ejection. These are really, really worrisome. And then yet another phenomenon that tends to be the main driver for the radiation belt enhancements at many times are the high-speed solar wind streams. So all of those things can give rise to very high-energy particles from near Earth out through the magnetosphere, out into interplanetary space, and permeating much of the solar system. So let's stop there. I think that's about time for the break. And we'll come back in about 15 minutes or so. Yes, questions? Yes. Right, right. Well, as I intimated, I think we have to figure something out, or else it's sort of a showstopper. So the best thing I think you could try to do is to devise a mission that one takes natural advantage of things you're going to have like water or so that might surround, and so you'd have a place at least to go to protect yourself from the most acute effects from the particle event. The galactic cosmic rays are much more of a challenge. And so the best thing you can do is just do it as fast as possible. So going there fast is a good idea. How you slow down without having to have immense amounts of fuel is the other challenge. So I think that many people argue, well, let's find people who are radiation tolerant and only send them. Let's only send old people. You know, there are a lot of different ideas. And one way is another view. And if I get to choose who it is that's sent on the one-way missions, I think I could probably go along with that too. But I think this still has to be regarded, if done by national agencies such as NASA, it's a showstopper. Commercial outfits who want to do this may argue that they've got some way around it or that it's okay. But I don't think, as a policy matter, most people, at least in our country, would really stand for it. Sorry, that's a Weasley answer in a sense. But. That's correct. Yeah. Yeah. And it's not just a matter of, well, you know, it's sort of too bad, but I mean, you're presumably sending people there for a reason. They're supposed to do something. If they get there and they're completely dissipated by the radiation, they can't stand or they can't function, then what was the point of spending trillions of dollars or whatever it's going to cost to send people there if they're dysfunctional because of the radiation effects? So this is something that, it's like the elephant in the room. People don't want to really face it. Okay. I'll be happy to answer more questions, but let's take a break and come back 3 o'clock. Okay, great. You've done well. So I've been looking at you carefully. I have seen very few closed eyelids. 2 o'clock. 2 o'clock Central. 2 o'clock Mountain Time. 3. I thought we were going to get a break. Okay, see you guys in about 10 minutes.